Outside, the pale mist of an early winter morning in 1326 drifted across the land, and the wind whistled through the gaps in a thatched roof like the whispers of hungry ghosts. In a weathered wooden house on the edge of the village of Prouvin, nestled in the northern countryside of France, an old woman named Margaret huddled over the hearth, coaxing the last embers to life. Her frail hands trembled as she poked damp twigs into the ashes, trying to revive a faint orange glow. Firelight flickered across her deeply lined face, revealing eyes that had witnessed a lifetime of hardship. Her 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, were still curled together under a worn wool blanket, their thin limbs pressed close for warmth. The cold crept into their skin, but it was the hunger that truly made them shiver. On the hearth, a thin gruel simmered in a dented iron pot. It gave off no aroma, just a bland mixture of old oats and withered vegetables scraped together from the last corner of the pantry. There was no salt, no fat, no flavor to excite the children. But it was all Margaret could manage after another lean winter. "Mama, do we have bread today?" the youngest child asked in a hoarse whisper, eyes lighting up momentarily before dimming when Margaret gently shook her head. "No, my dear, but I saved the thicker part of the gruel for you." No one replied. Only the sound of their growling stomachs filled the room, a quiet reminder that life still lingered here, stubborn and starving. In much of recorded history, people talk about great kings, glorious battles, and towering castles. But history wasn't written in crowns and swords. It was forged by the bony hands of women like Margaret, by empty pots, and by the soft cries of hungry children. Food in the Middle Ages was said to be terrible, but not merely because it lacked taste. It reflected a world shaped by hierarchy, where what you ate, or whether you ate at all, depended entirely on the social class you were born into. Somewhere else, at this very hour, a young noble might be nibbling on goose pastries and sipping cinnamon-spiced wine. But here, in Margaret's frozen cottage, the children dreamed only of a dry crust of coarse black bread, hard enough to hammer nails. Food was the language of class. In the Middle Ages, you could tell a man's rank just by peering into his bowl. The rich ate variety, spice, and meat from afar. The poor ate the same thing every day: porridge, black bread, boiled roots. For the lowest classes, a full belly was not a given. It was a small, daily victory. There were no refrigerators, no markets, no choices. Every bite was the result of labor or barter or sacrifice. Once, Margaret would later recall at the age of 60, I had to choose between keeping the hen for eggs or killing it to make broth when my youngest had a fever. And that wasn't a choice. It was a sentence. Winter was an invisible enemy. Medieval winter was no romantic snowfall. It was a trial, a death knell for the poor. When pastures turned to mud, firewood ran out, and seeds weren't enough to sow and to eat. People boiled bark, roasted roots, scraped dried onion skins, and hoped the frost hadn't yet claimed the last cabbages. Margaret's children learned to dig through snow for stray carrots missed at harvest. They called it winter treasure hunting. But it wasn't a game. It was desperation dressed up as play. And so the journey begins. This story you're about to hear isn't just about food. It's about survival, about empty bowls, ethical choices made under hunger, and the dim flicker of hope in times of darkness. We'll go from Margaret's filthy hearth to the palace kitchen, where Guillaume, a royal chef, roast swans with nutmeg, and through this discover the cost of power, the cruelty of class, and the true value of a meal. In 1334, on a stone-paved street in Venice, the footsteps of Luca, a young spice merchant, echoed softly as waves lapped gently against the canal walls. The early spring sun danced across wooden crates packed tight with invisible treasure. Black pepper from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, nutmeg from the Banda Islands. Everything was tied down, hidden, and guarded as if it were gold. Luca was not born into wealth. His father, a sailor, died of fever during a voyage to Alexandria. But as a child, Luca had been fascinated by strange scents. The first time he smelled cloves spilling from a torn sack, he stood frozen in the warehouse, eyes closed, imagining distant lands where the air itself smelled like magic. Today, his goods were destined for a Florentine lord who was willing to pay the price of 7 fattened oxen for a single pound of nutmeg, a number Margrethe, the peasant woman far away in Provence, might have heard once in a sermon, but never truly believed. In Venice, spice was more than seasoning. It was a symbol of status, a kind of silent currency in noble circles. A dish with pepper announced power. A cup of wine laced with clove whispered refinement. And saffron, golden and rare, wasn't food. It was prestige on a plate. But hundreds of miles northwest in Margaret's village, the gruel still simmered, pale and lifeless. No pepper, no salt, just boiled turnips, shriveled greens, and hope. "Mama, do you smell something sweet?" her eldest daughter once asked, eyes sunken from sleepless nights. Margrethe didn't answer. Perhaps it was the priest's house down the road, preparing for a feast day. Or maybe it was the imagination playing cruel tricks. Hunger, when it lasts long enough, begins to invent flavors. The taste of hunger isn't bitterness. It's absence, a hollow on the tongue, a yearning that tastes like memory. Margrethe remembered the last time she ate lamb stewed with garlic on her wedding day. Even garlic, the cheapest of all seasonings, had vanished from her kitchen long ago. In the Middle Ages, there were no spices for the poor. Commoners used what they could find, onions, mustard greens, sour vinegar, to convince themselves that a dish had flavor. But most of the time, these only made the gruel more pungent, harder to swallow. Luxury spices, cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, were written about in medical scrolls, reserved for royalty, or whispered of in awe by servants. The world Luca lived in and the world Margrethe survived in were separated not by distance, but by fate. One dined on roasted songbirds stuffed with walnuts and dusted with pepper. The other choked down watery porridge and called it dinner. Luca, while sailing across the Red Sea, once wondered, do the poor even know what pepper smells like? But he never said it aloud, because deep down he knew. They didn't. The flavor of spice isn't only on the tongue, it's in access. And in a world where survival depended on what you could grow or beg for, access was the most precious thing of all. Today, we, with Himalayan salt and soy sauce in our cupboards, forget that a single pinch of cinnamon once cost as much as a life. We forget that men crossed deserts, died in storms, and vanished into jungles, not for gold, but to bring back flavor. And peasants like Margrethe? They never even knew what they were missing. They only wished just once that their gruel could smell like something, anything, other than the damp blanket in the corner of the room. Steam rose sluggishly from the cracked iron pot, smudging the already smoke-darkened beams overhead. Margrethe squatted near the fire, stirring the gloopy mixture with a chipped wooden spoon. Her children sat in a quiet circle around her, their eyes expectant, but wordless. They had long since stopped asking what was for dinner. They already knew. Tonight, she added a handful of crushed, dried peas gathered from a monastery's alms the day before to thicken the gruel just slightly. But still, it was gruel, still gray, still lifeless, still tasting like rainwater left in an old cup. Not far from Margret's village, in a larger town, a middle-aged baker named Halric scraped the bottom of his flour bin. His tiny shop sat tucked beside the church wall, and though his hands were calloused and his apron forever dusted with white, his pride had always been in the purity of his bread. Once he had boasted that his loaves were honest and strong, like a man should be. But that was before the harvest failed, before taxes rose, before the plague crept near. Last night, for the first time, Halric mixed in fillers, a scoop of bran, a pinch of dried sawdust. It wasn't poison, just compromise, just desperation. He didn't look his wife in the eye when he slid that first batch into the oven. The bread still rose, the crust was still golden, but the smell was hollow. When an old woman bought one and chewed slowly, squinting, Halric forced a smile. New firewood today. Oak burns hotter. He didn't tell her he had just broken the vow passed from father to son, never tamper with bread. In the Middle Ages, bread wasn't just food. It was survival. It was the center of every meal, from peasant breakfast to noble feasts. But the quality of that bread drew clear lines. White bread, from pure wheat flour, was for nobles. Gray bread, from barley, legumes, and wild grain, was for laborers. Black bread, from anything that could be ground, was for desperation. Margret usually traded an egg for one small gray loaf each week. But lately, she had begun slicing it in halves to last longer. Her children gnawed the crust, hard and tooth-breaking, while she saved the softer middle for the youngest. One day, she caught her child licking crumbs from the floor. He looked at her, not ashamed, but simply asking, "Is this okay, Mama?" She didn't answer. She just turned away. Halric saw it too, when a ragged child snatched a torn crust from the bakery trash and disappeared into the alley. For a moment, he saw his youngest son in that shadow, and then he stirred more sawdust into the dough. The poor didn't always choose hunger over morality. Most didn't have the luxury of either. And the law? The assize of bread and ale, a royal statute from the 13th century, set standards for quality and price. But who checked the bread of a village baker? Who protected a mother forced to gnaw on moldy crust to hush a starving child? When bread is baked with sawdust and shame, it isn't just food, it's a fracture, a crack between trust and survival. Halric still bakes every day. He still greets customers with a forced cheer, still claims the oven smells better than yesterday. But every time he plunges his hands into the flour sack, he whispers an apology. No one knows who he's apologizing to, his customers, himself, or God. Perhaps all three. As spring crept slowly into the village where Margret lived, the first rains of the season did not bring renewal. They brought rot. The leaky thatch roof grew heavier. The floor, already damp from winter, turned to mud. In the dim kitchen, Margret untied the last strip of dried fish from a rusty iron hook above the hearth. It had hung there since January. The skin had turned leathery. The surface now carried a faint white fuzz. She scraped the mold off, sniffed it briefly, and decided to cook it. She had no other choice. That evening, her youngest daughter developed a fever. By morning, she was vomiting, her lips cracked, her eyes unfocused. Margrethe sat beside the child, stroking damp hair, whispering prayers. But in her gut, she knew there was no doctor, no medicine, no clean water. The little girl died after 2 days, quietly, without much pain. The body had long since grown too weak to resist. Margrethe wrapped her in an old cloth. She buried her between 2 struggling cabbages in the garden. Her eldest helped dig. He didn't cry. He had learned not to. Crying, after all, changed nothing. Medieval people didn't talk much about death. They lived with it, ate beside it, slept under the same leaking roof. They drank from the same stream corpses floated through. They washed clothes where pigs wallowed, and they learned silence. In London, the River Thames was both a lifeline and a death trap. Every waste, from human filth to animal carcasses, was dumped into the same water people drank from. Children scooped it with tin cups. Women rinsed greens in it. The sick bathed wounds there, and death was born there. The story of King John of England is a bitter testament to that truth. In 1216, after a banquet of roasted game, stewed apples, and ripe peaches, the king fell gravely ill. Within 2 days, he developed severe dysentery. Groaning with pain, he traveled with his entourage toward the Wash, a coastal marsh notorious for its tides. He lost his treasure wagon there, sinking into the tide with his royal jewels. A few days later, he too died. Not from poison, not from battle, from peaches, likely spoiled by poor storage. Food-related death made no distinction between peasants and kings. There was no concept of hygiene, no knowledge of bacteria, no understanding that flies on meat were not just nuisances, but messengers of decay. People believed smells caused disease. They burned herbs, hung scented pouches near their mouths. But the real killers hid in old meat, undercooked stew, or salted fish left too long. Villagers called it the cold inside. They lit candles, sprinkled ash, waited, and while they waited, another child would die. Each meal was a gamble, each sip of water a risk, and life, like the smoke from a dying fire, flickered on a frayed thread. And yet they lived. They stirred the pot again. They scraped fish skin, boiled bread ends, fed children first, because in that age, surrender was never an option. The village bells tolled through the misty dawn, each chime dragging time a little slower, a little heavier. Today was Wednesday, a fasting day. For the rich, this meant little. The kitchen would simply prepare trout instead of pork, pastries with almond milk instead of butter. But for Margrethe, it meant no fat, no milk, no eggs, just thin porridge with wilted greens, and the hope that God would be full enough for the both of them. Lent had arrived. 40 days without meat, without milk, without cheese or eggs. 40 days when hunger wasn't just a burden, it was a virtue. Margrethe understood. She believed, not because someone told her to, but because it was all she had left. After her husband died of fever, after her firstborn withered in the cold, only faith had kept her upright. But faith does not provide calories. By the second week of Lent, she was boiling onion skins to flavor water. Breakfast was thin gruel. Supper was stale bread soaked in well water. The children cried. They did not yet understand the difference between sacrifice and starvation. One night, her second son crept into the chicken coop. He snatched a single egg and bit into it raw. When Margrethe found him, he was weeping, not from guilt, but from terror. not of her anger, but of damnation. He had broken Lent. Margrethe held him, whispering, "If God is angry, then I will ask him to forgive you." Elsewhere in the village, another child was not so lucky. Caught sneaking a scrap of dried meat, he was beaten bloody by his father for sinning. No one stopped it. No one questioned it. Church law was divine law. At the same time, the monastery fires still burned. The monks still baked loaves, brewed ale, and handed out food on Fridays. They called it holy charity, and people like Margrethe queued quietly, receiving a small loaf and a cup of barley water, then returning home with trembling gratitude. A young priest, one Margrethe sometimes watched silently during Mass, once slipped her a sack of dried roots, whispering, "God does not live only in ritual. He lives in the belly of the hungry." Margrethe didn't reply. But that night, for the first time in 3 weeks, the gruel was thick again. In the Middle Ages, religion ruled not just souls, but stomachs. The church calendar hung on the chapel wall, dictating when to eat and what to eat. Breaking a fast could bring public penance, fines, even excommunication. Not because the poor didn't want to obey, but because they had nothing left to give up. Among the nobility, Lent was another stage for performance. They showcased elaborate fish dishes, imported dried figs, and sculpted sweets made from almond paste. They called it pious dining. But to people like Margrethe, Lent was simply a deeper hunger draped in holiness. Faith was the only thing the poor could afford. It was the flicker at the end of the tunnel, the one reason to stir the next pot of gruel. And still, sometimes Margrethe wondered, if God is the Father of all, why does his table not feed everyone? She never asked the question aloud, only whispered it, while kneeling beneath the wooden cross, worn smooth by generations of hands like hers. It was June of 1345, and the lavender bloomed purple across the hills surrounding Castle Montelieu. Inside, beneath the flicker of over 100 beeswax candles, Lord Darnot's feast unfolded like a sacred ritual. The stone great hall shimmered, tapestries from Flanders glowing in firelight, silk gowns rustling like leaves. On the table, silver platters bore a pageantry of excess, a whole roasted swan, its curved neck reattached and lacquered with honey, sat as a centerpiece. Around it, stuffed sparrows, venison soaked in wine, and a pear tart laced with nutmeg, a spice so rare that even Halric, the village baker, had never touched it. In the kitchens below, Guillaume de Lartille, the royal cook, commanded like a conductor. Nearly 40 now, he wasn't noble by birth, but he'd served nobles for 20 years. He knew their tastes, their cravings, their secrets. He knew which spices hid the odor of turning meat. He knew how to make rot taste like luxury. Tonight, he prepared 12 starters, 9 mains, and 7 desserts. Each dish a message. Saffron glowing in golden rice. Almond milk froth to replace cream for religious guests. Red wine boiled with cinnamon and cloves. Aromatic camouflage for a duck that had turned on the hook. Guam watched the lords and ladies laugh, tear meat from bone, and sip wine with pursed lips. None asked how old the goose was. No one questioned the fish's journey through warm cellars. They didn't want to know. Ignorance was a kind of power. When Lady Adelise, young, pale, beloved, suddenly stood from the table gripping her stomach, Guam's hands clenched. He had seen this before. The egg yolk wine sauce had simmered too long. The almonds were stored in a damp crate. She vomited for hours. A servant whispered, "She'll recover." But Guam knew better. Sometimes death did not strike at once. It fermented. In the corners, the servants stood still, eyes locked on the dishes they would never taste. After the feast, they'd eat scraps, cooled, half picked over, perhaps licked, and yet they were grateful, because outside, people like Margaret had no scraps. A feast was not just about food. It was theater, a ritual of wealth, a performance of superiority. Even kings were not safe. King John had died from spoiled peaches. Dozens of nobles had fallen from food-borne illness, masked by wine, perfumed by spice, blessed by ignorance. Guam knew. Every time he sharpened his knife, he wondered, am I feeding them or poisoning them? Still, he did not stop. This work gave him shelter, paid for his child's schooling, clothed his wife in velvet on Saint's Day. When the feast ended, wine spilled onto the stone floors and nobles collapsed into velvet cushions. Guam sat alone in the kitchen, washing the long carving knife. He stared at the leftover duck, tender, fragrant, dusted in nutmeg, and thought of the village where he was born, where his mother had once wept over an empty pot at Christmas. He whispered to no one, if only she had tasted this. But she had died from spoiled fish stew. Death did not care for rank. It simply changed costumes, from brown rags to red velvet. The year was 1316. Rain fell for 40 days. Barley fields drowned. Potatoes rotted. Grass withered. People called it the year without a summer. Margaret, then not yet 30, had known hunger, but she had never seen this look in her neighbor's eyes. Not fear, not despair, emptiness. Even the hens stopped laying. Sheep became bags of bone, and the air smelled of mold, wet and sour, like the inside of old bread. They called it the Great Famine, a time of meals made from bark, roots, bran, and sawdust, a time when fathers cut their portions in half to give to their children, then collapsed within days. No one laughed, no one asked questions. They simply endured. But famine doesn't just kill the body, it erodes obedience. In Kent, England in 1381, a group of peasants decided they had endured enough. They grabbed pitchforks and tools, and they marched to London. We sow the seed, they eat the feast. We starve, they feast. We die, they pray for us. For the first time, the hunger turned into a voice. The peasants' revolt had begun. Their leader, Wat Tyler, a former blacksmith, became the banner. They burned tax records, stormed manor houses, made lords kneel. One night in the square, a mother placed her child's corpse, wrapped in linen, on the lap of a captive nobleman. She said nothing, just turned and walked away. The man sat frozen. He never opened the bundle. But rage doesn't last forever. King Richard II, just 14 years old, stepped forward and promised, I will be your king. He lied. Wat Tyler was killed. Soldiers returned. Peasants were hanged along the fields they once plowed. The survivors bowed their heads, but they were not the same people anymore. They had seen something. The powerful could bleed. After the Black Death killed half the population, land lay abandoned, and laborers became valuable. For 2 decades, wages rose. Some peasants chose their lords. Diets improved. A few families ate meat more than 3 times a year. Margaret remembered roasting a rabbit once, not because it was gifted, but because she caught it herself. But the dream was short-lived. New laws were passed to restore order. In truth, to chain the poor again. Wages were frozen, mobility restricted, peasants forbidden from dressing above their station. God placed each soul in their rightful place, church law said. Margaret couldn't read it, but she understood it by the ache in her back and the tightness in her belly. The revolt had failed, but the fire had started, in crumbs shared under the table, in glances exchanged in the fields, in lullabies that no longer pleaded, they warned. They were no longer begging, they were remembering that those who plant the wheat have a right to eat the bread. Margaret was now over 70. Her clouded eyes could no longer thread a needle, but still lit up at the sound of children's feet racing past her door. She lived alone in a stone cottage on the edge of the village she never left, the same village where smoke once rose from hunger, not hearths. People called her Old Margaret who endured, not because she was a hero, but because she simply didn't die. Her family had scattered. One child had died of fever. Another had left for the city. The last had married far away and sent letters now and then, faded ink, crooked words. But she kept them under her pillow like a lifeline. Every evening she sat on the doorstep with an onion in her lap, one she had grown in her patch of soil. A thin cat slept at her feet, purring while she spoke softly, to it or to no one. Once, she whispered, I made soup from wilted cabbage. My youngest smiled after eating it and fell asleep. He said it was the best meal in the world. She wept a little, not from sorrow, but from memory. The way eyes gleamed, the way laughter echoed in lean houses, the way one crust of bread could hold a family together. She had kept everything, a broken spoon, a cracked pot, a frayed string that once tied a sack of monastery grain. To others, they were garbage. To her, they were sacred. Each object a witness, a fragment of proof that she had once kept her children alive with nothing but fire, breath, and faith. The village children visited on quiet afternoons. They sat around her like around a fire, listening to tales of smoke-flavored hunger, of rain soup, of feasts made from turnips and hope. They did not laugh. They did not interrupt. Somehow, they understood these stories weren't in books. One child asked, Why didn't you leave the village and look for food somewhere else? Margaret stared into the fields. Because your mother was too small to walk, and I could not leave her behind. She never told them she once thought of dying. In the winter, her daughter died from spoiled fish. But one morning, she saw the eyes of her youngest, still blinking, still needing her, and she knew she had no right to leave, so she lived on, not out of hope, but because someone needed her to. That summer, the village held its first harvest festival in decades. They offered Margaret a seat of honor. She sat next to the priest and the village head, staring at a small plate of golden apple tart, drizzled with honey. She didn't eat it at once. She inhaled it slowly, then whispered, It smells like a dream. No one fully understood, but no one said a word. That evening, she returned home. She watered her onions, fed her cat, lit her lamp, and wrote a letter, not to anyone specific, just to write. In it, she said, If you are born in a time of plenty, remember those who starved so their children could live. If your meal is late and you feel annoyed, remember the children who died before the pot could boil. If life seems dull, try listening to the sound of a spoon scraping the bottom of an empty pot. That is the oldest lullaby humanity knows. The letter was found years later after her passing. She was buried beside the apple tree she had planted from a festival seed. Her grave bore no birth date, no titles, only the words, Marguerite, the one who always shared her last piece of bread. The sliding doors opened with a gentle click, and suddenly there was light. White, brilliant light. Straight rows of abundance, floors so clean they reflected your footsteps. Fruit piled in neat pyramids, labels from lands Margaret had never heard of. Chile, the Philippines, South Africa. To the right, strawberries out of season, mangoes in winter, grapes with no seeds. Across the aisle, beef from Argentina, chicken from Norway, salmon flown in from the Arctic Circle. Every shelf a map of the world, and all of it year-round. A woman walked in with her phone in one hand, scanning barcodes with the other. Her cart filled quickly. 4 types of bread, 3 of milk, 24 kinds of cereal. If Margaret or any medieval peasant could have stepped into this place, they might have dropped to their knees, not in worship, in disbelief. An onion bigger than a fist, with no worm marks. A sack of rice so white it looked divine. A bottle of oil, golden, clean, pure, standing like a holy relic on a shelf lined with 10 others. They wouldn't know where to begin, wouldn't understand why there were 7 kinds of cheese, 10 kinds of salt, a whole aisle of food already cooked. They might cry before even tasting anything, just from the scent of safety. Because safety has a smell. It's the smell of food you don't have to question. They might ask, "Who paid for this?" And the answer, whether we like it or not, would be, they did. The ones who died in winters too long. The ones who split a crust of bread 6 ways. The ones who buried children beside frost-killed cabbage. The ones who stirred thin porridge and prayed it would be enough. They paid. We are their heirs. But sometimes we forget. We grumble when delivery is late. We complain about bland tomatoes. We throw away half a loaf because it's a bit stale. We forget that once stale bread was a treasure, that once flavorlessness was the taste of survival. Modern supermarkets are not sins. They are miracles. They are triumphs of science, trade, labor, and longing, but they are also temptations. Temptations to forget, to consume without memory, to waste without guilt. And somewhere between the LED lighting and soft background music, there is a silence only the hungry can hear, the silence between excess and empathy. We have everything, but do we feel anything? If a child today asks why food is so easy to get, they should hear about Margaret, about onion broth and rainwater, about mothers who didn't eat so their children could. If Margaret could say one thing to us now, she might say, "Chew slowly, look closely, and remember, someone died so you could eat without fear." A meal, any meal, is a miracle. But the miracle does not come from the store. It comes from memory, from history, from gratitude. Night falls gently on the old village square. The air carries the warm scent of apple tarts from Halrich's bakery, now run by his grandson. The breeze rustles through the tree Margaret once planted, now heavy with ripe fruit, dropping quietly into the grass like blessings. The world has changed. We no longer split turnips 3 ways. We don't fear that our gruel will sour overnight. We open refrigerators, tap buttons, and food appears as if it's our birthright. But history, if not remembered, fades. We don't need to go back to eating bark and broth to appreciate what we have. But we must remember. We must remember that. A white loaf of bread once marked a man's rank. A clean onion once saved a family. A feast could kill a king, and a bowl of gruel could keep a child alive. Food has never been just sustenance. It's always been message, symbol, testament. When we eat, we do not only feed the body, we feed the memory of our species. we say to the past, we remember, and to the future, we understand. Progress is not about forgetting the struggle, it's about honoring it, not about leaving the past behind, but carrying its lessons forward. We still face challenges, climate change, inequality, waste. People still go hungry, not because food is scarce, but because compassion is. So let history be not just a mirror, but a map. Let us teach children that every meal is a gift, not a guarantee. Let us see farmers, bakers, and delivery drivers not as background, but as miracle workers. Let us share, not because it's noble, but because it's right. Let us remember the hands that once turned soil, the hearts that once sang lullabies to the sound of an empty pot. People like Margaret don't have monuments. They did not write books. They did not fight wars. They did not rule kingdoms, but they sustained life. They kept the flame alive in the dark so that today we could live in the light. And for that, every meal is a silent eulogy, a thank you, a promise that we will not forget.